Hello, my name is Pauliina Remes. I'm very happy to be part of this series on YouTube videos on ancient philosophy, and I'm going to talk about talking. So today's topic is Plato's Protagoras. Why that dialogue? Well, it's a dialogue about the possibility of teaching through speaking, although I'm not going to talk about that main claim so much as what happens inside the dialogue and in the dialogue form. The dialogue form allows the people in the conversation to challenge, to question the way in which the exchange or the synousia happens. And we see this happen a lot in the Protagoras. The main contenders, the main opposition is between Protagoras and Socrates, and between long and short speeches. Socrates obviously goes for short inputs, whereas Protagoras is a fan of long speeches and he's good at that and enjoys giving them. The background thus being partly the agonistic culture, the idea that persuasion and winning the argument are important things, sometimes that speaking happens merely in order to create pleasure, versus Socratic and Platonic interest in pursuing inquiries. Socrates is criticizing Protagoras and trying to push him to adopt his own style. Well, we first get a couple of metaphors very quickly about them. I mean, these don't come in the order of the dialogue, but I'm trying to gather for you some inclinations about what's going on in the dialogue. We've got two metaphors, that of sounding of a bronze, the idea that a speech is a limitless sound that goes on and slowly vanishes, quiets down gradually. Perhaps Socrates or Plato is telling us that there's no clear ending, there's no resolution. Perhaps there's no clear indication what has been answered. I mean, there's no clear way of determining whether the question that, say, Socrates posed was answered by the speech that Protagoras gave. Perhaps there's also the idea that a monotone sound that has no internal structure. Is this a fair critique? Of course, these speeches were very well structured. They were carefully crafted. Maybe the idea is that there's no internal principle connected to the content of the speech or of the question that is being discussed that would bring it about that certain situation counts as an end, namely as an answer to the question posed. If there is structure and end, they are extraneously determined not by the topic of the discussion or the question which was posed. And this, of course, was also connected to the moral aspects of the discussion. The sophist is used to being listened to, not so much listening to others, and takes a lot of shared space, I mean, the sound going on and on without any interruptions. The second metaphor is one of sailing full blast to the sea of words with no land in sight. This enforces the idea of a monotonous plenitude of words rather than a structured logoi or arguments. Why is there no internal structure? Here we get one indication. There's no clear aim. With no land in sight, the navigating has become impossible or hard. There's no clear direction. The aim is missing. Is this a fair critique? One can also ask, depends of course what you think the aim is. Socrates seems to be insisting, or the other people in the dialogue that suggest that, grant that Protagoras is giving too long speeches, that such a contribution to the conversation is not an answer to a question, and Protagoras did concede to answering in his own way, namely giving a very, very long answer, a speech. Let's have a look at one passage to get some more indications. So, After a long answer, again, not a whole full speech, but a long answer, Socrates says, Protagoras, I happen to be a forgetful sort of person, and if someone speaks to me at length, I forget what he is talking about. It's just as if I were a trifle deaf. In that case, you would think it right to speak louder than usual if you were going to talk to me. So now, since you're dealing with someone with a bad memory, cut your answers short and make them briefer if I am to follow you. What do you mean by telling me to give short answers? Protagoras asked. Are they to be shorter than the questions require? By no means, I said. The right length, then, yes? So are they to be the length that I think right, or that you do? A good question. Let us first take this at face value. There might be a small problem of taking it face value. We might think that Socrates is a person with a very good memory. He's the one who can control long and complicated arguments. He might be capable of that. It's nonetheless true that I might not, or the regular reader of Plato might not, or Socrates' discussion partners, the interlocutors, might not. So there might be something that we can take here at face value, namely the idea that we need some landmarks to remember and to understand the steps of an argument. And the idea here is that there's no clear indications given, no clear steps of the argument indicated. Socrates goes later on to demand that Protagoras should not run too fast, again giving a metaphor or an activity that perhaps is likened to talking. And the idea is that if one runs very, very fast, then one might get to the goal very quickly, or to one's aim, but one is not paying attention to, one can't reflect when doing that, one can't indicate the landmarks on the way, and thereby an activity like arguing, where we want to make sure that everyone taking part in this shared argumentation is able to follow the steps, should proceed more slowly and make the steps of the argument clear. There's also, of course, some sort of idea that short contributions to a conversation can possibly be more precise. This isn't something they discuss in Protagoras at any great length, but there are some indications, as good scholars have pointed out, about akribeia, the precision, or answering with a certain amount of precision. The important challenge in the quote, however, is not uttered by Socrates or someone else, but by Protagoras himself, who says that, more or less, that length and shortness are relative terms, and the question that then becomes of what is the appropriate length. Monique Dixon has recently drawn attention to this and shows very wonderfully in that article that what, for example, counts as a digression and how legitimate it is to embark on a digression depends in the dialogues on the importance of the topic discussed. Some topics clearly are such that they require more space. They might be such that they require the entire life to discuss. However, in the Protagoras, we're not really talking about the length of entire conversations, but we're talking about the length of the conversational inputs, your contribution to the joint discussion, and the length of that. Even there, however, the relativity holds. It might be that certain contributions should be longer than others in certain situations. Think of an answer that is put in a format that can only be answered yes and no. Then there's a certain length that is required in that context. In some other context, a longer contribution would be clearly more ideal, desirable. There's another problem for why it is inadequate to talk about mere length. And this comes as a kind of a side issue within the irony when Socrates and the others talk about Laconian brevity. What if we discussed with very brief inputs, ideally brief inputs, let's say Epicurean maxims? So what if I say in a conversation something like this. Sorry, they are here. One must philosophize and at the same time laugh and take care of one's household and use the rest of our personal goods and never stop proclaiming the utterances of correct philosophy. And then you reply, in the same period of time, both the greatest good and the dissolution of bad are produced. Maybe a bit mean-minded example since they didn't have clear relation to one another, but I think that's actually revealing the whole point. It's not just about length of the inputs, it's the relationship that the contributions or the inputs have to one another. So what is the missing link? It's reciprocity. From early on in the dialogue, almost to its end, what we translate as conversation or discussion is synousia, a kind of talking that happens together, a being together, spending time together and speaking together with one another. Also, activities that are done together are said to be in the dialogue more effective, and people, as Alex Long has shown, prone to seeking confirmation to their views from other people, according to this same dialogue. The format Socrates insists thereby is one in which, as he says, each participant gives and takes something. So we want a give and take relationship, a reciprocal relationship. The challenge of this we see when the sophist and other gentlemen present try to find a medium, a kind of way in the middle of Protagoras and Socrates formats and styles in order to bring this to some sort of fair agreement about how the conversation should proceed. Alcibiades is very concerned about fairness, and he thinks that it is indeed unfair for each of the speakers to speak in a style that they are not comfortable with. And this is also something Socrates has elsewhere agreed to. So what to do if both of them only excel in one kind of game? The solution Alcibiades offers is a kind of a diathlon. A diathlon of first long speeches. Protagoras has had his opportunity and shown that he's very good at that, and Socrates has accepted that he's not as good in that game. And now Alcibiades says now it's Socrates' turn to play the other game, the short question and answer game, and Protagoras to be at a disadvantage. Now, this solution shows the problem of lack of reciprocity. There's no shared aim. Both aim at their own winning rather than something shared. There's no commitment to one and the same activity as a shared or joint activity. There's no shared commitment to rules, the shared rules, the joint rules. But both insist on having their own rules in their own part of the game and imposing in their turn these rules that they like to an unwilling and maybe even slightly ignorant competitor, a competitor that hasn't shown proper commitment and understanding why we should choose these rules and how we should play the game according to the rules that the person is not familiar and very enthusiastic about. So this is not a shared game. The solution to try to fix the unfairness is hardly ideal. While the format that Socrates is suggesting is clearly has this reciprocity. So, and I'm sure that Plato thought that there were some virtues about that were clear in comparison to these agonistic alternatives. Plato can also, through this meta discussion and through looking at this from a distance, show how this Socrates' insistence on the conversation to follow his question and answer format, the rules that he imposes, as a certain kind of use of power. So it is Socrates who wants to impose these rules, the norms of this activity, thus turning the merisounosia, in which everyone could decide over their own contributions and the format and length that they take, into an activity of a much more structured type, that of his inquiry of question and answer format. The norms of conversation and inquiry, the origin and type of the normative regulation, and the epistemic relevance connected to them is what the dialogue form, the performative aspect of these works, draws our attention to and allows us to reflect. Thank you.